And we'll make a start. Are we on our live stream? Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, well, good to have everyone and those who are listening in. We're going to be studying from chapters 16 to 20 of 1 Samuel in just a few moments here. It's good to have Ed back. He's manning our sound system back there. So good to see him after a spell. All right, let's begin with a prayer, if we may. Let's bow our heads. Father, we are grateful for this opportunity to meet together. We're grateful to be your people. We're thankful for the blessings that you've shown us in your Son. And Father, as we study from your word this morning, we pray that we can learn from these Old Testament events how you shaped the history of Israel and how different ones responded to your will, and may we learn lessons that will help us in our obedience to you, and may we ever have a desire to do what you want us to. Please bless our classes, bless those who are listening, and be with us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I had a little review there at the outset, so let's just see if we can think about what we've been looking at. Chapter 16 to 20 is where we are today, so we're kind of zipping through the book of 1 Samuel, and then we'll have 2 Samuel in front of us. So here are some events on the left-hand side, and we've talked about the structure of 1 and 2 Samuel, and we've said the first 15 chapters there we can divide into the three sections on the right. So where does the birth of Samuel fall? Which of those areas would you say, A, B, or C? Okay, that's probably an easy one. A, the birth of Samuel in chapter 1. Then what about Saul failing to destroy the Amalekites? Okay, B. Actually, C. Okay, yeah. Chapter 15, that was the last event we looked at last time. We'll really kind of start there this time. Oops, I gave you this one. Saul anointed king is right in the middle of that. So chapters 8 to 12. And the people demand a king, and then Saul is anointed as their king. What about number 4, Ark captured by the Philistines? Where does that take place? Yeah, early on, chapter 4. And that's where Phinehas' wife gives birth to the child and says, oh, the glory of God has departed. Okay, what about Israel demanding a king? Obviously, that precedes Saul being anointed. It's actually in chapter 8. Okay, that's the chapter where the people come before Samuel and say, your sons aren't walking in your ways, and we want a king to lead us. What about Hannah's prayer? Where would you find that in the book? Early on, yeah. Letter A, chapter 2. And then we talked about Saul issuing a rash vow. Anybody remember what the vow was? Who did it have reference to? Yeah, his son was affected by it, Jonathan, because he's the one that kind of led the charge against the Philistines, so they started pursuing them, and Saul said, nobody can eat anything until we've done all the mopping up here. And Jonathan hadn't heard about that, and so he helped himself to some honey. And so that's in chapter 14. And then finally, Samuel's farewell address. Remember where that fits into all of this? It's actually the last part. This is a little misleading because we studied it last week, but it's actually at the end of that second section. Okay, so if you put those all together and kind of arrange them in chronological order, you can kind of see there Samuel's birth. His mom dedicates him to the Lord. The priests aren't behaving, and so the ark is captured. And so they recapture the ark. The ark is given back, but then Israel wants a king. Saul is anointed. Samuel addresses them. We looked at that last time, and he says, really, you need to do what God says. It's just kind of the same theme once more. Then we had several instances where Saul disobeys God after having made a pretty good start. So think again about these three sections. You remember what we called those? What's the first section really center on? First 7 chapters in 1 Samuel. Okay, so yeah, it really has to do with Samuel as being judge, and that first 7 chapters, his birth, and then these incidents that take place, that the ark is given away, and then his ruling as a judge or acting as a judge. What about chapters 8 to 12? What have we termed those? Okay, God calling Saul as king, and chapters 13 to 15, God rejects Saul as king. So that's what we studied last time. Like we said, Saul makes a good start, and he seems to be what the people need. He leads them out into battle, but then it starts to go downhill. So we're going to see what develops then today as we look at chapters 16 to 20. So here are the sections in those chapters. These are what were on your lesson sheets. Samuel is sent to anoint David, and then Saul needs some help, and David is chosen, and then we've got the battle with Goliath in chapter 17. That's a pretty lengthy chapter. And when they come back from that episode, Saul begins to get jealous of all the attention that David is getting. And that theme continues throughout. He continues to pursue David almost any way he can get him. And David really has to make a decision about what he's going to do. So let's look at each of these sections and see what we can get here. Give me just a second. I thought I had... Nope. Okay. So in chapter 16, where does it start there? Now remember, in chapter 15, we had just seen Samuel confront Saul. He had failed to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And I don't know that we really mentioned this. At the very end of the chapter, does Agag meet his death like God declared? Okay. At the hands of Samuel. So Agag thought he was going to survive, but no, Samuel comes and it says, he takes the life of Agag. So chapter 16 begins, and God says to Samuel, I've rejected him from being king. How long are you going to grieve about this? Get your horn and go to Bethlehem, because I've provided for myself a king. And Samuel's question is, if I go down to Bethlehem, what's that going to do? Raise a little suspicion, and we'll see here in a moment on the map, why that might be the case. But he sends him to Bethlehem, and it's interesting, when he gets to Bethlehem, the elders come out, it says, trembling, and say, do you come peaceably? Well, why would they react to Samuel that way? Well, maybe because of that episode at the end of chapter 15. Agag was hacked to pieces, and Samuel carried that out. So here Samuel's coming to Bethlehem. That might arouse a little bit suspicion. But he says, I'm coming peaceably. And then he calls Jesse and his sons. I think I said here, and that's the wrong, those are verses 1 to 13, should be at the top. But I don't know if this was at Jesse's home or Jesse and his sons were invited, but what's the process when they come together for this sacrifice? They're coming to the sacrifice. Samuel has been told by God, I'm going to anoint the next king. And so immediately, what does Samuel think when Jesse's sons start before him? What's his thought? Okay, yeah. Abinadab, the firstborn, shows up and he says, surely this is the one. Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But then there's this great statement that we read. I'm sorry, that's Eliab, not Abinadab. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature. Now, what's that remind you of? Yeah, Saul is the one that was head and shoulders above everybody. And God says, I've rejected him. But the Lord sees not as man sees. He looks on the heart, not on the outward appearance. So kind of a theme that continues all the way through that. God looks at things differently than man does. Do you think that's true today? Do we tend to look at the externals? Why do you think that happens? Why do we get so focused on the outside? Okay, we might be a little bit foolish. Well, for one thing, we can't see the inside like God can. We can sometimes see the fruit of things, so I guess we're limited in that respect, but we're impressed by the things that we see. And God's really telling us he's concerned about the spirit to start with. Rick? Okay, all right. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So that charisma is important, and so, that begins to be, to a degree, manufactured in a lot of cases, isn't it? Yeah, Michael? Yeah. Okay. So we get fixated on the outside, and then, things are done to make that impression, but what's really important is what's on the inside. And even David will see, yeah, David was good looking, but what was important was who he was, not what he looked like. Okay, so Samuel says, well, is there anybody else? It's not any of these that have passed through. And then Jesse says, oh, yes, I forgot about my youngest. He's out there with the sheep. And so Samuel says, bring him in. So kind of interesting, youngest, not necessarily shortest, but it's kind of like, okay, he's been overlooked. And Saul was so impressive, but David ends up being the very one that God has chosen. And he says, anoint him. This is he. And then we're told at the end of the verse that the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him. And Samuel goes back to Ramah. Okay, then in the next section, we've got Saul in verse 14, after being told the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David. Verse 14 says, what about Saul? It says, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And I'll just tell you, I don't know exactly what all that involves. Are we talking psychological? Are we talking about some kind of direct influence upon them? I tend to think it's more Saul's reaction to things than something that God is doing to him. And so he's obviously got these difficulties. Okay, I got these two switched around. So this should be 14 to 23 here, the next section of verses. So the Spirit of the Lord departs from him, this harmful spirit. So what do his men decide? What does Saul need? Yeah, some kind of therapy to help him through these troubled times. And they seize upon, somehow they know about David, and what kinds of things do they say about him down in verse 18? What would commend David? Yeah, skillful in playing. He's a man of valor, man of war. How do they know these qualities? Prudent in speech, a man of good presence. And notice, last of all, the Lord is with him. So how would you qualify David based on that description there? Yeah, good choice, well-rounded. He's qualified in several different ways, isn't he? But he's skillful in playing, and that's what they seize him for. He begins to play for Saul, and it says, verse 21, Saul loved him greatly, and in fact, he becomes his armor bearer. And then he wants David to remain in his service. So David, even from the very outset, seems to be very loyal and trustworthy in the service that he's providing. And you can't read the cities here, but up at the top is Ramah. That's where Samuel was residing. Then Gibeah, just below that, is where Saul lived. Jerusalem in the middle there, kind of a point that we would recognize. And then Bethlehem down at the bottom. So you can see why maybe Samuel going from Ramah all the way down to Bethlehem might arouse the suspicion of Saul to start with. And here they are, the same places where you can read the name of the city there. This is a picture around the 1900s of Bethlehem, so give you some sense of what that might have looked like coming into that city. Here's an artist's rendition of Samuel looking at all of Jesse's sons. This is a picture of a harpist, Eshnunna, and that's earlier than this time period, but you know, instruments are around and were used. And then here's a picture, I think this is an Assyrian armor bearer. So we just read that description about David. So give you a little bit of an idea what that might have been like. Okay, so that section ends with Saul receiving some relief to a degree. And that leads into chapter 17, which is a familiar chapter. And there's a little, question about the relationship between chapter 16, chapter 17, because on the one hand, David doesn't seem to be known to Saul, and then yet he goes out and fights this battle, and his exploits are well known, and the relationship there. But whether this is exactly chronological or not, we're told at the start of chapter 17 that the Philistines and the Israelites are lining up for battle. And this is nothing new, is it? We've seen this already several different times. So as we've said, the Philistines are kind of the nemesis. So this battle is going to take place over between Azekah and Socoh. And that's close to Gath, and Goliath is from the city of Gath. So if we look at that a little closer up, that's the view. And you've got the Philistines, it says, in Socoh. And the Israelites, we don't know precisely where they were, but somewhere in that valley of Elah. And you'll see in the next few photos here some pictures of that area. That valley just kind of snakes through. And so at some point, the Philistines are camped across from the Israelites. And here are a couple of photos. I think I might have had one last week of the Philistines, their kind of distinctive headdress. These are actually Philistines captured by the Egyptians, so this is an Egyptian relief. But if you can see at the top of those bodies, you see this headdress, and there is one that's in color, so a little more distinctive. So you think of those soldiers lined up out there, and of course Goliath is at the head. So this is looking back, I believe, from the east, back toward Socoh down there in the bottom. The valley runs up the middle, and you've got Azekah there on the right-hand side, and several other views of this. But you can see that valley is pretty wide there, isn't it? And that's where they're aligned. So this is where the Philistines would have been, this mound here, Socoh. And Goliath and his forces are on one side. You can see there how the valley snakes down through that area between Azekah, and then Socoh would have been down on the bottom right. And there you see it from another direction. Okay. So at least some kind of visualization there. Here is Gath, that is further west. That's where Goliath comes from, we said. So when Goliath appears, what do we find out about Goliath? What would you say about him? You were sizing him up for battle. He's pretty tall, 8 or 9 feet tall here, depending on what you get when you figure out a cubit, which I think Ray had told us. The cubits from the elbow to the top of the finger there, something like 18 inches. I'll have a photo here in a moment of an actual measuring rod that was a cubit. So there wasn't any universal standard cubit, I would imagine. But not only is he large, he's got a lot of armor. And it's all described there. I mean, it sounds like it would be a burden just to put that armor on, much less fight in it. But that's what they're facing, and Goliath comes out and begins taunting the Israelites. You know, and his idea is, let's just have one-on-one fight here. We'll determine who the winner is. And notice down in verse 11, it says, he says, give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, why is that important in the scheme of things? Or is it? Okay. They're certainly lacking faith in God. And who's supposed to be leading the army of Israel? Saul is supposed to be that one that they've chosen. And he's done that in the past. But it seems like here he's kind of shirking his responsibility. And you can understand that, but that's the frame of mind that he's in. And maybe that's a carryover of what we read there in chapter 16. Okay, so David comes to visit. His father sends him to the front lines to check how his brothers are doing. And as he visits, he hears this giant coming out and taunting the troops. And how does he respond to that? Yeah, he doesn't like it. This isn't how somebody should be treating God and his cause. And so he takes offense at what's being said. And in fact, he responds to that, and his older brother doesn't like that. He said, why are you out here doing this? You know, why are you mouthing off about this? You're supposed to be back tending the sheep. But David is insistent about this. Notice in verse 26, he takes offense as far as God's cause. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David's thinking in terms of God's cause, not David's cause. And he's offended by this. And then in verse 31, he says to Saul, when Saul hears about David's willingness to do something, he said, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Okay, so he's ready to take on Goliath. And then what's his thinking there in verses 34 down through verse 37? Is this kind of just bold and brash on the part of David? I can go out there, I can take him. Give me a chance. Well, what's his basis for making that statement? Is it totally unfounded? What's he say, Juan? Okay. Yeah, he says, I've been through this situation before. I've had bears and lions, and I've killed them, and the Lord delivered me. You know, he's not just bragging about his own exploits. And he said, if he delivers me from that, he'll deliver me from this. Well, what's Saul's reaction on the other hand? Saul's kind of thinking like Saul. And how is this Saul thinking? Okay, he's worthy opponent. So what do you need, David? You need to go put on what? Here, try on my armor. Okay? First he says, you're only a youth. So David is young. He recognizes that. But he tries to put his armor on him. He says, the Lord be with you. Yeah, I'm all for you going and being this one who confronts Goliath. And so what's David's reaction to the armor? Doesn't fit, you know. It's kind of like trying on somebody else's clothes. They don't really fit. That's not me. And really, that's not what he's about anyway. So how would you contrast those two reactions? Well, what's the key in this, or is there one? Is it just all about whether the armor fits? No. It's really, you know, whose cause is this? Where is our faith? What are we trying to accomplish? And David seems to trust in the Lord, whereas Saul has lost confidence. And then there's Goliath, who, when he confronts David, you know, he's just full of contempt and disdain for who David is and this young man that's come out. And we've all taught the story, probably heard it taught. And so David goes out and he slays the giant, despite all of the derogatory comments. You know, he says, 43, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And so David responds, verse 45, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I'll strike you dead. So here's that cubit I was describing. I think this is Egyptian, tomb of Tutankhamun. And here's David trying on Saul's armor and deciding to go without it. Okay, and then these stones were probably bigger than little pebbles. And these are some stones they found, I think, at Lachish that they used with slings. And here's the size one of those would have been. So maybe something as large as this that David uses. And it's kind of interesting when you think about this battle. What did the Lord do for David? Did he work a miracle here and suddenly David was able to win this battle? Any evidence of a miracle that's taking place? Okay. All right. Okay. So maybe steadying him. It just seems like David is acting as a result of his faith, his confidence, and he is skilled at what he's doing, and he wins this battle. So, the result of that is, you know, Goliath is defeated, the Philistines are routed, they start to escape, go back toward Gath, the Israelites chase them, and they win this great victory. And at the end of that section, really the start of chapter 18, you get Jonathan's reaction to David. So let's just look at that for a moment. Here is Jonathan. And who is Jonathan in the scheme of things? He's Saul's son, which means what? Yeah, he's a prince. He's probably the heir to the throne if Saul was going to be on the throne. But Saul's already been told back in chapter 13, excuse me, I've rejected you and your family. You know, you're not going to reign on the throne any longer. And then Saul himself is rejected in chapter 15, God says. And that's why David's been chosen. I don't know that Saul knows that yet. Hasn't been announced. How does Jonathan respond to David? What does Jonathan see in David? Yeah, a good friend. Anything else we could say? Yeah, okay, all right, his own son. He's really a kindred spirit, isn't he? He's like David in a lot of different ways. He's courageous. You know, Jonathan did the same sort of thing back in chapter 14 when he attacked the Philistines. And they're both capable in battle, and they both have a great faith and confidence in God. So there was a lot that would draw them together in terms of what they wish to accomplish. And it seems like they have this friendship to start with. It's kind of interesting when you think about this day of battle, because here Jonathan gives David his own garments. You know, he's willing to part with whatever he has, and those might have been some royal garments. And again, here's a picture. This is the Persians later on, but you can kind of see some of the distinctive clothing that might have been true of someone who was royalty. So Jonathan's saying, here, you can have any of this. So all in a day, David has defeated Goliath. He has tried on the royal clothing of Saul, the armor, you know, maybe kind of symbolic of what David's going to be. And then Jonathan, his own son, is willing to part with what he has to give him those things. All right, any comments there before we go on to chapter 18? Any thoughts about that battle between David and Goliath? A great story, but it's a narrative, it's a factual, historical account of this battle that David is willing to wage and God helps him to win. Okay. Then in chapter 18, they come back from battle and the women come out singing And the first verse is, Saul has slain his thousands. We like that. Saul likes that. But David has slain his 10,000s. And Saul doesn't like that part so much. And so it says, verse 8, Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And then he asked, at the end of verse 8, what more can he have but the kingdom? And so it says, from that day forward, what? Saul's got his eye on David, doesn't he? Which means what? Okay. Yeah, he's wary of him. You know, what's going on? I don't trust him. Not because David had done anything untrustful, but just because of what's happened to Saul. We already know that his temperament has changed. And so in the next section, it says the harmful spirit rushes upon Saul. He raved within his house, and David's playing the lyre. And so Saul proceeds to do what? Yeah. So how'd you like to be playing the instrument there, piano or something, and somebody takes a spear and throws it at you? In fact, he throws it twice. I don't know what that suggests. Maybe David's being patient, you know. I'll give you another chance, and he does the same thing. But Saul is, you know, sort of taking desperate measures here. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. Ironic, isn't it? He's throwing the spear, and yet he's fearful of David. And he's fearful because he realizes the Lord was with him. Look at verse 14 of chapter 16. That David has success in all his undertakings, for the Lord is with him. And so it says he had fearful awe of him. Even though Jonathan and Israel love and respect David. So what about Saul's demeanor? What would you make of this? You know, he's obviously battling a lot of different things here, but what would you say about his frame of mind? Does it make sense? Does it just seem like it's... Yeah, okay, I think that's a good way to describe it. Slowly losing it. Okay, paranoia we would talk about. Just a fear of what might happen and what's happening to him. And God has been pretty direct with him. And so all of this is having its effect. Yeah, things are slipping away. And he doesn't, you know, we see all the pieces of the puzzle fitting together as God was directing this, but Saul is not aware of all that. He just knows that God's rejected him and David's coming into the limelight, okay? So, you know, it's almost like he's losing his rationality, his ability to cope with some of the situation here. So his daughters now enter into the equation. He's got a couple of daughters. The first one he promises to David, kind of a dowry if David will go out and defeat the Philistines. And before he even has opportunity to do that, Merab, his older daughter, is married. But then there is Michal, and look down in verse 21, it says, Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul is really using about anything at his disposal in order to try and defeat David. You know, I think he was for David going out and fighting the Philistines, but that could have been David's demise. I guess he wasn't as concerned at that point. Here, he's offering his daughter in marriage, but with the hope that somehow David is killed in the process. And he himself has tried to attack David unsuccessfully. So now he thinks, well, Michal might be that snare. You know, if you have to go out and kill this many Philistines. And David seems to be kind of humble about, you know, taking the king's daughter in marriage. You know, he's coming from a poorer background. But he's willing to do this. Verse 25, Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And so David goes out and he kills the Philistines and he gets Michal as his wife. And so he's able to accomplish this. And Saul at the end of chapter 18 is even more fearful. And it says, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. So, can we relate this to anything in our lives? Is this just what kings do when their power is threatened? Any kind of relevance for us? Can we ever get envious or jealous of someone if we're not careful? Okay. Okay. That's a great point. You know, faith is not understanding all the details. Faith is trusting in God and doing what He wants us to do, even though we may not know that entire equation. And, you know, we've read this statement about the Spirit of the Lord being with David, being harmful to Saul. But again, you know, it's not like God is just causing all this. He's chosen David. But Saul's reacting to all this in a negative way, in a toxic way. And he's kind of destroying everything around him because he is envious and jealous. Rick? Okay. Okay, good. Okay. Right. Okay. Easy to feel threatened. If we've established ourselves in some way to do something and someone else comes along, do we feel threatened by that? Or are we willing to accommodate that and be helpful to that? You know, and Saul had been rejected, but that's what's happening here. Okay, look at chapter 19. Saul's not done yet. And it starts out there, and this is interesting, 19 and 20 are sort of a contrast. He speaks to Jonathan and says, we need to kill David. And Jonathan responds by saying, not really, because Saul hasn't done anything to us. So here's the point at the end of chapter 18. Saul's doing what he can to plot against David. Here are some women being depicted as coming out and playing music, kind of like what we read. Here's Saul, a picture of his being troubled, and David soothing him and then using a spear. All right, so let's go on. So now Saul speaks to his own son, says, we need to kill him. And Jonathan says, no, he hasn't sinned against you. And in fact, he's done a lot of good for us. Why would you kill him? And how does this episode end? Is this the one where Jonathan has the spear thrown at him? Okay. So, Jonathan's not even safe around his own father. Yeah, there it is in verses 8 to 10. Okay, all right. You're right. Okay, so this back and forth, Saul always, he's willing to say okay, but then he turns right around and does something else that threatens him. So yeah, he's in his presence, David is in his presence, and then we have the episode with him throwing a spear at his own son. And so David escapes. He goes home. Michal hides, kind of vouches for him, puts this teraphim in the bed, and makes it look like David is there in the bed, and she helps David escape. David goes to Samuel over in Ramah. And so again, you've just got episode after episode in which they're trying to escape. This is apparently Saul's fortress at Gibeah. So here's where Saul would have been residing. Here are some Assyrian soldiers with spears, since Saul was wielding those. Give us an idea what that looks like. Okay, so he does go to Ramah, and he is there with Saul, and you've got this episode where Saul sends messengers 3 different times and then finally comes himself, and God causes the messengers and then Saul to prophesy. So that is something supernatural. God is defeating Saul in his efforts to get David. So even God comes to his defense on this occasion. But then we come to chapter 20, and there's this long chapter in which basically, it seems David approaches Jonathan and says, this is getting pretty desperate here. And so now Jonathan's first questions, is my father really out to get you? He says, far be it from you, you shall not die. But then David says down in verse 3, there's only a step between me and death. I need your help. And so the plan is, rather than go and appear again and take a chance that his life will be taken, David is going to go into hiding. And Jonathan will say, well, David's at a feast. If Saul notices that he's gone, which he does. And so on the following day, he wants to know where David is. Saul wants to know where he's gone. And Jonathan answers as he does. And it's kind of interesting to me the way he speaks to his own son here, if I can find it. Verse 30. Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? It seems like Saul has these fits, and at this point, he's really just unhinged. And so Jonathan knows at this point that David's life is indeed in danger. And he goes out, he shoots the arrows. They make this prearranged thing where he's going to shoot the arrows, and if he says they're beyond you, then David knows he's in trouble. And that's what happened. So David and Jonathan kind of see each other there, one of the last opportunities. And what does Jonathan ask David to do? What's his request? I mean, they kind of make a covenant between themselves. What does Jonathan realize that it seems like Saul has not been able to comprehend? Okay, he loves him. Okay. Yeah, David, will you honor my family? Why is he saying that? What does he realize? Okay, Saul is going to be taken, the throne's going to be taken from him. And so he's not going to be the next reigning king. David's going to be the king. It seems like he appreciates that that's coming about. And so he's asking David, please take care of my family, because what usually happens when one family takes over from another family, you usually wipe out the previous family and all the descendants. There are plenty of examples of that. And so they've got this strong friendship between themselves. And that's kind of how chapter 20 ends. So, thinking about their friendship, let's close with this. Well, I should have been going through these. There's the new moon. That's the feast at the start of the month. That's a rock, not the rock, but where they could have been hiding. That's an arrow flying through the air. What are some benefits that David gained from Jonathan's friendship? And let's just think in general about friendship. What are some benefits that we derive? And especially as brethren, I think, when we have that close tie between us. Can you think of anything? Okay. Okay. Okay, so you may be in a situation where there's antagonism with someone, maybe through no fault of your own. But here's someone else, maybe someone that's close to that person, and they're willing to help, So it's not all bad. And that's part of what Jonathan is able to do for him. What else about a friendship that's meaningful or helpful? If you got a friend, you usually can do what? Yeah, confide in someone, talk to them. If you've got a problem, you can go and discuss that with them. And we've seen several times where Jonathan and David do that in reference to each other. Some kind of support, some kind of encouragement. Yeah, Michael? Okay. 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 So it's really, part of that is what you do as a result of that and how you react. So he had someone to talk to. He was willing to sacrifice anything he had for David. Isn't that often the case in a friendship? Someone else will do something. What do you need? Well, what do you need? I'll give you the shirt off my back to help you out if you're in need. He defended David before his father, even rebuking his own father, and Jonathan was a constant source of encouragement. So friendships are important, and we can certainly think, okay, do I have friends like that who would do that for me? Or you could turn that around and say, can I be that kind of a friend for someone else? Am I willing to take those actions and help others? And as Christians, I think we're always concerned about doing that. Well, we're out of time, and next time we'll keep going through chapters 21 to 26, and things are going to get worse. David has to basically leave Saul's presence, and so he's running here and there. He becomes a fugitive. So we'll study that, and then the following lesson ends 1 Samuel with Saul being killed in battle. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate your attention this morning.